everybody, to the 6th installment of the Duolingo English Tests, Innovations in Language Assessment webinar series. We're very happy that you're all here today. I'll just give everybody another minute or so to log on. And just so everybody knows, because the people usually ask, yes, we will be recording this. I just hit record. We'll be uploading it to our YouTube channel where we keep these recordings. You can watch it again, send it to all your friends, share it with everybody that you like. In just a few moments, let's see, I'm going to give a few more people a chance to log on, and then I'll hit it to Anthony so he can give our guest a formal introduction. Let me see. All right. I'm going to say this one more time because I'm saying it as people are joining. Welcome to our webinar. We're so glad to have you here. If you've not attended one of our webinars before or been in a Zoom webinar, the only downside for you as a participant is that you cannot turn on your camera or your microphone. So you'll remain silent to us throughout the webinar. However, we do have the chat open if you guys want to chat amongst yourselves or make any comments along the way. And the Q&A function is there at the bottom bar of your Zoom screen. You can submit any questions that you'd like Carsten to address after he's done speaking. He'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll spend about another 20 minutes on Q&A after, and we'll record that as well so that it's in the webinar if anybody misses it. Okay, Anthony, I think you're up. Would you like to introduce our guest?
Yes, thank you. Welcome everyone to our latest edition of the Innovations in Language Assessment webinar series. Today, our guest is Professor Carsten Roever, who's a professor of linguistics and applied linguistics at the University of Melbourne. He's a well-known figure in Australia and New Zealand, as well as worldwide. His main areas of interest are second language pragmatics and interactional competence, which will be the subject of his talk today. I also want to mention some highlights of his publications. He's got a very popular book called Language Testing, the Social Dimension with Tim McNamara. He has a book called Second Language Pragmatics with Taguchi, and Pragmatics and Second Language Learning with Gabby Casper. He also has a self-authored book called Testing ESL Pragmatics, which was published in 2014 by Peter Lang. So without spending more time talking about Carsten, I'd like to welcome him, and we want to start listening to him. So over to you, Carsten.
Okay, thank you very much, Anthony. Thank you for that kind welcome, and Sophie as well, of course. I have prepared a self-introduction slide, but it seems like I won't need that, so I'll skip that and go straight to my talk. So the structure of my talk today, I will briefly talk a little bit about what I mean by pragmatics and interactional competence, just in case not everyone is entirely familiar with those areas, and it's always good to define your terms. Then I will give a quick overview of research on testing pragmatics and IC, but my main focus will be IC. I will briefly talk about pragmatics, but it'll mostly be about interactional competence. Then I will talk about, and this is intentionally phrased a bit provocatively, I will talk about how IC will save language testing. And if you think that sounds weird, just wait for it. And then I'll talk about some challenges in assessing IC, the hurdles that we'll have to overcome for IC to actually be able to save language testing. So let me start out by talking a little bit about what I mean by pragmatics and by interactional competence. So pragmatics is actually a very large field. The International Pragmatics Conference is coming up in Brussels, and it always has thousands of participants and a multitude of different strands going on at the same time. But pragmatics overall is concerned with how language relates to context. So in second language studies, we usually look at it as language use in social settings. So how the real world context affects the way we talk, beyond grammar and semantics, beyond just the pure knowledge of the language code, but really how do we adjust how we talk to the setting that we're talking in, and to the interlocutor that we're talking to. So you talk differently to a friend, then you talk to a colleague, then you talk to a parent, then you talk to your child. But if you talk to a colleague who's also a friend in a work context, like in a seminar like that, you talk differently than if you talk to that same person having a drink at a pub. So the context that you're speaking in and who you're speaking to affects the way you talk. That is essentially what pragmatics, especially second language pragmatics, is interested in. Traditionally, pragmatics coming out of philosophy, Austin, 1962. You may have heard this book title, How to Do Things with Words. Austin looked at it from a very performative perspective, like if the right person under the right circumstances says to the right people, I pronounce you married, or I pronounce you husband and wife, or husband and husband, or wife and wife, depending on where you are, then the world changes. You have used words to actually do something with words. But nowadays, we still see it that way, but we have actually broadened that much more. Whenever we speak, we do something with words. We accomplish social actions, and this is where we get to interactional competence. So interactional competence, the term derives, has evolved actually from a paper by Claire Cramsch in 1986, where she was critiquing the ACTFL proficiency guidelines for not really being communicative or interactive enough. She was critiquing them for being a bit too static and proficiency oriented. And the more recent genesis of the term and the more recent redefinition of the term is by Joan Kelly Hall, whose picture is at the bottom of the slide, and Simona Pekka-Regdoler, whose picture is at the top of this slide. And they would probably consider interactional competence somewhat, well, the two of them actually might not, but I do, related to L2 pragmatics, but to put it simply, it's much more focused on extended interaction. And I'll come back to that important differentiation. Also, very importantly, interactional competence, most people who work in the area use as their theoretical framework conversation analysis. And conversation analysis is a very intricate and it's a research area that a lot of work has gone into since it was founded by Harvey Sachs in the 1960s. And Sachs 1992 is a collection of his fundamental papers. But conversation analysis is very interested in the mechanics of interaction, much more so than on the external context. In fact, it's very critical about the whole concept of external context, but let's not get into that. Its main interest is how an interaction works mechanically, how people manage to talk in an orderly manner in a way that makes sense to each other and that seems to preserve social harmony. So CA and sort of flowing on from that, interactional competence work has looked at things like opening and closing of conversations. It has looked at turn taking. There should really be a comma there between those things. It has looked at adjacency, so how turns follow each other and relate to each other, some being more directly related to others. Like if I say, how are you? It's sort of almost mandatory that you reply. And if you don't, our whole conversation runs into a lot of trouble. However, when it runs into trouble, we have repair. So how do we manage problems in conversations? How do we manage instances where we're not on the same page? They would call it intersubjectivity, where we don't have intersubjectivity. Preference organization, how do we manage delicate moments where I have to make a request of you that might cause you a lot of trouble? And general second language pragmatics has been very interested in that as well. How do we manage topics? How do we maintain an extended conversation and go from one topic to another? You may know that when you sort of just chat with a friend for half an hour, you start out with the weather and may end up with world politics. And in between, you've talked about your children and their soccer games. So how do people move between topics in a way that they almost don't notice? That it seems so smooth that they almost don't notice it. So if you're really interested in looking more into this, there's a very good overview by Pekka Rick-Dohler, 2019. She, in my view, she is sort of the queen of interactional competence. She would probably not like that title, but really she has written a lot about it. But also Richard Young has written a lot about it. There's a paper in 2019 by him as well, from a somewhat different perspective, which is very interesting. So you may sort of wonder how interactional competence and second language pragmatics relate to each other. And I'm not going to spend hours discussing taxonomies and how one might be bigger than the other. Really what happened in second language pragmatics, I would say there has been quite a strong paradigm shift from the more traditional speech act pragmatics that is based on philosophy and originally came out of Austin, and then John Searle developed it later on. That was quite popular in the 1980s and 90s. There has been a shift to interactional competence sort of from the mid-2000s. And since about 2011, I would say interactional competence has been kind of the hot thing in this whole area of people interested in social language use, because it becomes a bit problematic to now say this area is called second language pragmatics, when really what we mostly talk about is IC. The paradigm shift was really kicked off by two people, Andrea Golato in a 2002 paper where she critiqued the discourse completion test, of which I will show you an example a few slides down, which was the main instrument of second language pragmatics work. And Gabi Kasper, who wrote and there's a picture of Gabi here looking very happy, who wrote a 2006 paper basically explaining what the problems are with second language pragmatics, very much from a CA really perspective. And so this contrast that we have here is second language pragmatics versus second language interactional competence as research areas, frameworks, traditions. So pragmatics comes out of philosophy originally with Austin and Searle, and anthropology, politeness research has been strongly integrated, especially in second language pragmatics. A lot of the work, Gabi's original work from the 1980s herself, Gabi Kasper's original work, was on politeness from a speech act perspective. Anthropological work by Brown and Levinson about politeness in different cultures is on the pragmatic side. And then on the interactional competence side, we have conversation analysis, which came out of sociology as the main framework. And sociology is mostly concerned with how people manage their social conduct, how societies manage to live together and cohere. Practically, a very big difference in how they looked at language was that second language pragmatics tended to focus on one-shot utterances. So second language pragmatics was interested in how you do that one thing. That actually goes back all the way to Austin's Harvard lectures, which became how to do things with words. This, I now pronounce you married. I now christen the ship, Queen Mary, whatever. So it was about the one-shot utterance and what it does, whereas interactional competence is much more about extended conversation, because a lot of things that we don't do as one-shot utterances. If I ask you if I can borrow your car tomorrow to take my dad for a trip to the countryside, then I will not just walk up to you and say, can I borrow your car tomorrow? I would like to take my dad for a trip to the countryside. I would have a long prelude to that before, and I would lead to this request, or sometimes not even have to make it. So some things that we thought were one-shot utterances in reality are actually multi-turn enterprises, social actions happening over various turns. And that's what IC is interested in. The research done in second language pragmatics actually looked more at offline explicit knowledge. So because the primary research instrument was a written discourse completion task where you're given a situation and then you're supposed to write down or speak into a microphone what you would say in that situation as a one-shot utterance, you always had time to think. Whereas L2IC looks at interaction, conversation. You don't have time to think in conversation. You need to rely on implicit knowledge. Your implicit knowledge of interaction, your implicit knowledge of politeness, your implicit knowledge of language, grammar, all those things. You cannot carefully fine-tune and craft in a conversation. I've mentioned the research instruments a bit, the DCT versus the extended spoken discourse, and in L2 interactional competence work, we do originally the CA tradition is to use natural data, but that is actually quite difficult to do in reality. So we do elicited conversations where we give people a task and say, so, you know, have a discussion about how you could spend this weekend with a group of friends who are visiting from another country. What would you do in your city to spend a weekend with people, to entertain them? Discuss and then present what you would do. Or with role plays, we do a lot of role plays there, where you are put in a situation and then you have to manage an interaction in that situation. And in terms of analytical traditions, second language pragmatics was very much about coding and counting. So you would code particular features of language use and then count how often they occurred in this group and in the other group. Whereas interactional competence in a CA tradition is much more about practices. So what do people mostly do? What do they generally do? Under what circumstances do they do what? But we're talking about interactional circumstances. Under what interactional contingencies do certain practices occur, and under which ones do other practices occur? So I would say most of work on social language use, at least, yes, I think most of the work has moved towards the IC understanding because it's just so much broader than the somewhat more narrow and it seems to me quite old-fashioned understanding of L2 pragmatics. This is not to say that there wasn't plenty of research on pragmatics. So the assessment work, and this is what we're getting into now, of course, started with testing of L2 pragmatics. And the pioneering fundamental test battery by Hudson, Detmer, and Brown, and there's a picture of Tom Hudson there, was squarely focused on speech acts, on requests, apologies, and refusals. And that was then extended to other aspects, implicature, indirect language use, where you don't say right out what you mean, and routine formulae, fixed expressions that you keep reusing in the same situation, such as how are you is a routine formula. So that was a bit of an extension of that work in my own dissertation and a couple of other studies. And then Timple Laughlin, in her dissertation and later published in a paper with Ikyun Choi, extended that a bit further, even to speech styles, idiomaticity. So the scope broadened in L2 pragmatics. But I want to show you a typical item here from a pragmatics test or pragmatics research instrument. The kind of item, this is an item I used in my dissertation. So what we have here is a scenario. Eric works as a waiter. He's supposed to work this afternoon, but he hasn't been feeling well lately, and he wants to go see his doctor. He decides to ask his colleague Nikita to take a shift. And then Eric says something, and Nikita says, "Oh, I hope it's nothing serious, but yes, sure, I'll take your shift." And the task, so test takers see the whole thing. It's not that Nikita's response is hidden or something. They see everything. And the task is to reconstruct what did Eric probably say. And for that, we have a little poll, Sophie. And I have to tell you, I made a mistake in the poll. I said tomorrow when in the item it says this afternoon. So just pretend that in the item it says tomorrow.
Just pretend. Everybody should see this poll. Yes, people are replying. So
we can see the poll. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. All right, I'll give.
So what would you put there? What would Eric probably say?
giving people some time to reply. We've got a lot of replies coming in. Okay, we're almost everybody's replied. So I'm going to one last call for entry into the poll before I end it, everybody. Okay. Here we have it.
Right, and we're sort of demonstrating here the problematicity of this type of item, because we got an almost balanced outcome, but really the correct answer is, I've got a doctor's appointment tomorrow, do you want my shift? Because if you say, I've got something going on tomorrow, can you take my shift? Why would Nikita say, I hope it's nothing serious? You know, I mean, something going on tomorrow could be a birthday party. I'm not feeling well, I don't think I'll come in tomorrow. To then say, but yes, sure, I'll take your shift is either quite far-sighted or a bit presumptuous. And I've got a doctor's appointment tomorrow, do you want my shift? That would sort of work, you know. But the problem here is two things. The fact that all three options I gave you are sort of fine, you know, they don't precisely fit the scenario. But if the construct is pragmatic competence, none of them would be like weird or rude or, you know, indicating that someone is not pragmatically competent. So that's one problem. The other, and what I actually made it more difficult. So if you had to write that, it would be easier. What I gave you was a multiple choice DCT, which is nearly impossible to get right. And it doesn't work as a test item, but that's not what we're talking about today. The second issue here is that in reality, no one would walk up to a colleague, look at them and say, I've got a doctor's appointment tomorrow, do you want my shift? No one would do that. You would always start out with a greeting, an opening, then listen, I've got something to ask you, something along those lines. Okay, and the DCT item cannot replicate that. All a DCT item can do is allow you to put this core speech act, this core utterance in. So this was one of the main things that Casper criticized in her 2006 paper in terms of research, and it is an issue in terms of assessment. So if we say, if people can do that, then they are pragmatically competent, but are they really? So then we're moving on to interactional competence, and interactional competence here has very much broadened that. So research on IC, the first fundamental paper here was by So-Jung Yoon, who's on the upper right, and a somewhat similar study with some differences by Naoki Ikeda in 2021, focusing on interactional tools. So quite focused on sort of the traditional CA thing of interactional mechanics. Galaxy in 2014 had a paper about topic management, so that's quite a different tradition. In this respect, it's very funny. The British and the American tradition are really different. The British tradition is all about topic, and the American tradition is all about role plays. They really need to sort of come together a bit more. But she worked on topic management. And Dye in 2022, and that's David Dye down on the lower right there, worked on social roles, how people in interaction portray a social role, how they show themselves as being a friend, a mother, a doctor, a teacher, and so a customer, a boss, and so on. How do you get that across? How do you sound like something? In CA, that's called doing being, you know, doing being a mother. How do you sound like a mother? So this whole area of testing L2IC, it's been quite a hot topic. So there was a book edited by Salary and Birch in 2021. There were a couple of special, like 3 journals had special issues, language testing in 2018. Actually, LAQ essentially had a special issue at the same time. They just didn't call it that, but half the papers were about testing IC in the parallel issue to that LT issue. Papers in language testing and assessment had a special issue, and applied pragmatics just had a special issue this year in 2023. So here's what it looks like what Yoon did. Yoon used a role play. And in the role play, the test taker is called Jesse. And Jesse is talking to a trained interlocutor, and the trained interlocutor is the professor. So Jesse is asking for a recommendation letter here, but there's a problem. And having a complication is quite a useful thing to have. Steve Ross wrote a paper about that, who unfortunately recently passed away, wrote a paper about that a few years ago, about the complication in the role play, which OPI, I believe, also has. But what we have here is, so as the test taker, you have to ask your professor for a recommendation letter for a departmental scholarship. And this letter is due in a week. And the professor is quite willing to write the letter, ask the student about the due date if the student hasn't told them that. But here's the complication. The professor is going to a conference. So they might not be able to get the letter ready by the time the letter is due. So is it okay to submit it a bit late? So the student then is told to check, to respond to that and tell the professor that they will work it out. They will check with the department, and then they need to tell the professor that they can submit electronically or on paper. And the professor will say that they prefer an electronic submission. What Yoon did here was quite unusual, because she almost scripted these role plays, basically telling the test taker, you need to cover these points, and the professor, you need to cover those points. It's not uncommon to script a bit for a trained interlocutor, because you're trying to preserve some degree of standardization, but that's exactly what she was trying to do. She was trying to balance standardization on the one hand, which we need in testing, and authenticity. So if you overscript, it becomes quite inauthentic. If you underscript, no two role plays might be really comparable. So where do you strike the balance here? Here are her rating criteria, and I want to bring up the rating criteria because I'm going to come back to rating criteria in a moment. I think they're quite crucial. She had 5 criteria that are all very CA inspired. So she developed them bottom up from her data, which was amazing. But she looked at content delivery, so how topics are managed. She looked at language use, pragmalinguistic tools like modals and structures. Sensitivity to the situation. Are you providing background information to the interlocutor? Are you designing it so the interlocutor can understand? Listener engagement, so how engaged are you with the interaction? Are you displaying understanding? And are you being an active recipient? And pause length, so are there long gaps or is there too much overlap? Are you completing adjacency pairs? So these were her 5 criteria, and at least 2 of them are quite language oriented. I mean, language use, definitely. And sensitivity is to some extent language oriented. Now, by comparison, here is a task from David Dye. So in this task, so he just gave a long task instruction. So there are 3 people. His test was about Chinese as a target language. So this is partially in Chinese, but I'll just basically summarize what the task is about. So you have a friend, Jiang Xing, and Jiang Xing's mother, Li Jing, runs a Taobao shop. So a Taobao shop is something like eBay in the Chinese environment. And you know your friend's mother through your friend. You've met her a few times. She's always been very nice to you, so you really get along well. And then you bought some expensive bags from her Taobao shop because you thought they were a good deal. However, when you got them, you kind of thought they were a bit weird and the quality wasn't great. So you took them to someone who knows, to a retail shop, and you were told, no, they're not real, they're knockoffs. Now, Taobao policy allows you to request a refund in this situation. And you now decide to talk to Li Jing, and in David's scenario, that was a voicemail, but you could just as well do this as a role play. You decide to talk to Li Jing to discuss this situation. So your friend's mother, your presumably good friend's mother, who you know and like, sold you a fake bag and you want your money back, which you are entitled to. At the same time, you don't want to ruin your relationship with your friend or with your friend's mother. So just going in and saying, hey, what did you do here? I'm entitled to my money back. Give me my money back is not going to work. How do you manage this? His rating criteria were quite novel. So he had 5 criteria. And starting here with the top one, role enactment, talking in a way that's role appropriate. So here you're talking as a younger person to an older person, which matters in most cultures, but has special significance in Chinese culture, younger person to an older person, and to someone that you're friendly with, to a friend's mother. So your role is defined by that set of social norms and social roles. Then you have reasoning as a rating criterion, maintaining logic when you speak. So are your points sensible? Do the points that you make sense? Then you have affiliative resources. Can you build rapport? Because it's important to maintain the relationship. You have disaffiliation management. So where there is a conflict, where there is disagreement, how do you handle that? How do you manage that? And you have morality. So this means projecting yourself as friendly, easy to talk to, but that doesn't mean that you have to be a pushover. You know, you can argue your point, just in a way that means that you can still later on look this person in the eye, and vice versa. So how do you do this kind of thing? And he assessed it by these 5 criteria, which are very interesting because no one has done this before, especially the role enactment part. These are the 5 bands for role enactment. I'm not going to go through this in great detail now because it would take too long. But what's important, especially important from my point of view, about Dai's work as a continuation of the previous IC assessment work, is that his is not so language focused. A lot of the previous assessment work was very much proficiency oriented, and high proficiency would sort of push you quite a long way towards high IC. But his criteria, which actually came out of native speaker comments, he had learner and native speaker performances. He collected learner and native speaker performances and played them to linguistic lay people and said, so what did you think? Was this good? Was it not good? What was good about it? What was not good about it? And he built the criteria from this community member knowledge from the bottom up. And community members, we found that generally, McNamara has found that also in many places, tend not to focus on linguistic matters. You know, they tend to focus on, he sounded like a nice guy, or this person sounded really difficult to get along with, or those kind of things. But then David put that into these 5 rating categories, which I think was really an amazing piece of work. And he's always very happy to share. So if you want this dissertation, talk to him. He'll send you a QR code to download it. Open access. So having talked a little bit about what IC assessment can be, I want to now tell you why IC is the answer to all our problems. How IC can save language testing. Stakeholder beliefs are crucial. In language testing, it is really, really important for us as testers and as test developers to have credibility. Credibility with the stakeholders. Credibility with end users, be it test takers who feel I have a high score and I deserve that high score, or who feel, oh, I've managed to game the test. At LTRC, there was a really cool presentation on gaming tests. And with, in our case, very often universities or employers that need to feel, yep, that person has a high score, they walk in here, they perform, and I can rely on that. I can believe that if they have a high score for speaking, they can talk. There's no concern here. And it is especially speaking that has been a problem. Several studies have shown that there seems to be a disjunct between a speaking score on a test and people's actually real-world performance. And the concern with this is that, yes, of course, you could say, well, there are three other sections. There's reading, there's writing, and there's listening. Yes, that's true. But speaking is where I hear from my colleagues, and where I hear it not just from academics, but also people in other settings, people working in healthcare that get people who've taken tests and qualified to work in an English-speaking country, who say, this person has a great score and they can't talk to me. They can't talk to patients. They can't talk to clients. Yeah, they may write well. That's great. That's really good. But if they can't communicate well in speaking and often in listening, in the real world, if they can't communicate well, if they can't interact well, then they don't perform well and they hit a glass ceiling. So as a consequence of that, if people lose faith and trust in our tests, if there's a credibility gap, we have a real problem. So I think IC can go a long way towards closing the credibility gap. Some evidence here. So in a study with Naoki Ikeda in 2022, we found that for a typical TOEFL population, there's only a 29% overlap between TOEFL IBT speaking scores and an IC test score. So in other words, IC is not really captured in a TOEFL IBT speaking test. O'Hagan, Pill, and Jung, and there's John Pill there, who's at Lancaster now, did his PhD at Melbourne. O'Hagan, Pill, and Jung, with the occupational English test, the English test for medical professionals, found that adding, they didn't call it interactional competence, but they are essentially IC criteria about role-appropriate talk. Adding that added variance to the scores, variance that had been previously uncaptured. In our LTRC presentation with David Dye and myself, we looked at his results, his test, and we found that proficiency scores, and he used HSK, the Chinese proficiency test, explained 17.8% of IC test performance. So that's not a lot. And we found that native speakers ranged between 39 and 92% in their performance. So even native speakers are not great at that. But that clearly shows you that IC is something that doesn't really get captured by our normal proficiency construct. And I think what we have here is a case of an owe this insight to Julie Sykes. I say that every time because I'm so impressed with this insight of hers, that at higher levels, test takers basically have the language. They have knowledge and control of language code features, grammar, and vocab. Yes, you can always improve. You can also improve as an educated native speaker. You can always improve. But what they need to do is configure this for interactional purposes. And this is also something that native speakers need to learn and can improve on. And some people have a natural aptitude for that, and other people don't. But by not doing IC testing, by not looking at how people actually manage to conduct themselves interactionally in the real world, and thereby drawing conclusions about their real world interactional abilities, by not doing that, our construct is underrepresented, at least from the stakeholders' perspectives, who don't care about our careful construct delineation. So we define speaking as precisely that. Yeah, no, to them speaking is being able to talk. 4 challenges for making this happen. The first challenge is epistemology. In IC, and I've given this talk to people from the IC community who have a CA background. When I talk to them about testing, they look at me like I'm from Mars, you know. In IC, there's no clear right or wrong way to interact. CA is radically emic. It's about what makes sense to the interlocutors. And if the interlocutors don't have a problem, how are we to say there's a problem? But the testers, we need to say this is better, this is worse, this is right, this is wrong. That doesn't apply. So that doesn't really fit. I'll skip a couple of these points. They're all very fascinating, but they will go too far now. So there's no right or wrong is the traditional IC and CA perspective, but in testing we must take an ethic perspective. We must have an ethics standard and say there is a right or wrong, there is a better or worse, and it needs to be an L1 or an advanced L2 standard. And we need to identify differences and need to amplify these differences. So and I wrote a paper about this in the special issue of Applied Pragmatics, getting those two things, saying we're testing L2IC, but the people that really do L2IC would say, but what you're doing is really weird and odd and doesn't make any sense. Getting that together is quite difficult. Practicality is a huge problem. So IC testing, similar to pragmatics testing, is resource intensive. Item generation to some extent, but test administration, if you need to have role plays, if you need to have discussions, rating, if you need to listen to long conversations and score them, this is quite resource intensive. So of course, people recently have tried AI. Gary Oki and his colleagues have worked on this. It is interactionally problematic. If people know they're communicating with an AI, they don't talk the way they do to a human. So unless AI gets to the point where we can really disguise it, we're still not quite there yet. And when we look at rating, we've done a lot of work on automated speech rating, but features of IC are really not included in that yet. And Rina Gao is doing a PhD with me at the moment. She's trying to train a deep learning system to rate for IC features. An interesting idea that some people have sort of started thinking about, and there was a really good presentation by Luke Harding representing his colleagues at LTRC, is looking at monologues and what IC features are visible in monologues. And Dai did that as well, and Ikeda did that as well. But it's hard to come to terms with that, and we're not completely sure how much variance is covered there. The third challenge is value add. Earlier research has shown very strong overlap between IC and proficiency. Galaxy has shown it, Ikeda, Yoon, and you might say in those cases, well, I mean, if they're essentially the same thing, why bother measuring IC separately? We're just creating redundancy, you know. But more recent research has shown that not to be the case. So in my work with Ikeda 2022, in Dai's dissertation, O'Hagan, Pill, and Zhang has shown that especially at higher levels, and when I say higher levels, I mean something ILR 2+ and above, or like a low B2, we find a disjoint. We find a disjunct between IC and proficiency. And it is partially also that in some of those tests, the scoring criteria involved a lot of proficiency features, like in Yoon's test and Ikeda's. They didn't in Dai's, and so his was not quite as sensitive to that. But he also had quite high-level participants, where this effect of disjunking at the higher levels becomes quite apparent. So we need to sort of persuade the people that need to spend money on making tests that IC will actually add value. And, you know, if nothing else, it might add a value in terms of washback, because it also doesn't get taught very much, but that's a whole other webinar. And finally, an interesting challenge, an interesting intellectual challenge and practical challenge is the construct. So we do find a widespread of IC among native speakers. And David found that, and we talked about it in our LTRC talk. And, you know, if you come from kind of a traditional language testing or language teaching perspective, that may seem really weird, because you don't find a widespread of abilities among grammar ability among native speakers. Yeah, they do vary a little bit, but mostly they will score quite high, not with IC. So, but then if you think from a, not language professional, but normal person perspective, we all know native speakers in our L1 that manage to step on everybody's toes, whose IC is really not great. So then, given that, if native speakers can't necessarily do IC well, is IC still part of a communicative competence, second language ability construct? Are we actually measuring something that's outside of language? Are we starting to measure personality here? Are we starting to measure, agreeableness, empathy, reading the room? What is it exactly that we're measuring here? And I mean, I'm always, keen on knowing what it is that I'm measuring, but even if we say, well, it's sort of at the edges of language, and by the way, in the Hurlstein proficiency framework, it is also at the edges of language, but part of it. If we say that it is at the edge of language, should we test it? Or should we say, well, no, that's not part of language. We're doing language tests. So we're focused on code features of language, and that's what we're going to stay with. And that's great. And we're very happy in our own little closed off universe. But if we're trying to remain credible to the rest of the world, we may need to find a way to come to grips with that. And that takes me to the conclusion. So I would, I said LIC will save language testing. Maybe I can downtone it a little bit and say it would enrich language testing. Enrich. Still think it'll save it, but let's go with enrich for now. We have challenges here, definitely epistemological challenges, practical construct challenges, but they're interesting challenges. I mean, especially the practical challenge. We may get to a point with AI where this actually works. And I have only talked about conversation. I have not talked about things like text chat, for example, which is possibly an interesting, which I'm saying 2 points down, which is possibly an interesting approach where you could text chat with an AI. That you could possibly disguise that you're dealing with an AI there. So there's things like text chat. There's things like email writing. I mean, people still do write emails. So what can we do there? There's definitely for conversation, there is a potential in automated dialogue systems, AI, still shaky, but may get there. Definitely worthwhile exploring the potential of monologues. I mean, I never really thought they had that much coverage of the IC construct, but there is something there. There's something there. I still don't think they cover the construct really, really well, but they're sort of better than nothing kind of thing. But it's very important that they're recipient designed monologues, that they're not just like so here's the text, summarize it. Why, to whom, for what purpose? These kinds of things need to be there. But I think what's really crucial here and why IC is really important for language testing is that we need to adjust our constructs to stakeholder expectations. I mean, we're very good in defining our constructs, universe of generalization, and so on and so forth. And that makes sense to people like us. And again, in our closed off universe, it's all wonderful, but extrapolation, extrapolation inference in the Kane model. How good are we at extrapolation? And we tend to be not amazing at extrapolation, but it's really, really important for us to remain credible and to have the positive impact that I strongly believe we really can have and should have. And on that optimistic note, thank you very much. That's the University of Melbourne, in case you ever want to come and visit.
Thank you so much for that. We do have a few questions submitted via the Q&A function. If you're up
Sure.
to answer some questions, great.
So I'll open up my Q&A and I'll read the question here. How do you suggest accounting for individual differences in speaking style, especially with regard to L1 sociocultural expectations of appropriacy and the assessment of L2 interactional competence? As you noted in your example, these are perfectly viable ways to imply these are all perfectly viable ways to imply a need for someone to pick up your shift, all that related to the task. Yes. I mean, in the particular example I showed, it was constructed through the response to require a particular response, to require a particular test taker answer, because, and that was, I intentionally designed it that you had to give a reason, the doctor's appointment or not feeling well, and you had to request the shift to be picked up. L1, sociocultural expectations of appropriacy. So there's a quick answer and a not so quick answer. The quick answer is that people actually have surprisingly similar expectations of what's appropriate, especially if the context is well defined. It's actually, people are not all over the place. And when people start sort of working on assessment of pragmatics and IC, they tend to think, oh, it's going to be really, really difficult because everyone has a different view of that. And they really don't. You know, I mean, yes, they will differ a little bit, but they will also differ in judging fluency and stuff like that. So we can generally see that relatively well, but we do need content we do need domain experts. That's really what we're talking about here. We need domain experts. So in the work that John Pill did, who was actually here, which is great, in the work that John Pill did, the domain experts were doctors and nurses, you know. So you need domain experts to say, does this person talk like an X, like a nurse? Does this person talk like a doctor? Like what is expected of a doctor in our context to sound like? And, you know, does this person talk like, in a Chinese context, is this appropriate for talking to your friend's mother? So domain experts are generally quite able to judge this with a fairly high degree of overlap and agreement. It amazes me every time, but they really are. Second question here, how language, culture, and time-specific are elements of interactional competence? Would large-scale assessments run into fairness issues in measuring certain elements of IC that test takers from certain areas in the world may not be aware of due to either large differences in communication within a culture, or because the materials they're using to learn the target language might be dated enough that they no longer reflect norms of interactional competence? Absolutely, you know, and I mean, this work has been definitely done with L2 pragmatics as well, textbook analyses, looking at textbook materials that pretend that people talk in ways that they never talk. So is it, you know, what you're talking about here is the old Salinger transfer of training kind of thing. Is it unfair to test something that when test takers just simply don't know any better, but because that's what they've been taught? You know, if the test taker had a teacher who spoke with a particular accent and then took on that particular accent and keeps speaking with it, and you judge them as, you know, being somewhat away from a particular native speaker norm, is that unfair? So it's unfair in the same way, you know, and in that sense, every test is a bit unfair because we're scoring from inside that culture. And, you know, I'm a native German speaker. I haven't lived in Germany for 25 years. I'm here right now. I know that I wouldn't do great on a test like that because I don't really know anymore how Germans talk casually. So yes, it is an issue there. It is definitely a fairness issue there. But I think we encounter that fairness issue in just about every test, you know. And we wouldn't necessarily score, do they use the au fait turns of phrases like all good that everyone uses all the time. Yeah, that's not the point. You can portray a certain role with an accent and without sounding 100% idiomatic, as long as you behave like an X. Okay, moving my thingy over here a little bit. Thanks for the thought-provoking talk. You're very welcome. I was wondering if there's more, maybe less diff, oh boy, between gender or L1s in regards to IC measurement, considering IC is closely related to pragmatics. Nice dissertation topic. Let's do that as a dissertation topic. Let's have someone do a dissertation on diff in IC. I'd love to know the answer to that. I would love to know the answer to that. It's so new that no one has looked at this. You know, I can't even venture a guess. I am actually really interested in this native speaker spread. who are the high performers and who are the low performers. What is it about their performance? And David can write about this for the next 20 years. I'm sure he's got so much data. But what is it about their performance that made them appear so interactionally incompetent? What made the high performers seem so good? What is it? How do you come to grips with that? I find that very, very interesting. And if that somehow then overlaps with gender or with L1, that could be very interesting. I mean, in David's data, I don't think he has looked at that formally. He had people of different L1 backgrounds, and some who were sort of culturally, in terms of cultural traditions, closer to Chinese culture than others. Did that give them an advantage? I don't know. But it's a great question. Yeah, it's a great topic for a dissertation. Follow-up question. All right. How would you then account for something like, in the US context, stereotypical ideological standards about what doctor, lawyer, journalist sounds like as compared to plumber, carpenter, truck driver? In both cases, ideologies rooted in both racism and classism will affect how L1 listeners would judge the appropriacy of speech style. Yes, it probably would. I mean, and you're raising a very interesting point there. How much of saying that, okay, the way you talk, you pass. You sound like a doctor. You sound like a nurse. You sound like a manager. You sound like a customer. How much of that is perpetuating stereotypes? How much of that is just saying, okay, this is what we're used to, and at what point is it okay to resist? If you look at it that way, and it's a valid question, you're calling into question all standards, essentially. So I may not want to talk like that, and that's fair enough. I may not want to talk like that. And you find learners not wanting to give up an accent because they don't want to be, appear like one of them, of that target culture. They're quite happy showing where they're from. That's fair enough, but I would maintain, and I know this is kind of a hardcore assessment perspective, I would maintain that if they know that and they choose to do it, then they also choose to accept that they might get a lower score for that. Because we need to have some kind of standard. We need to have some kind of level that we judge against. And because otherwise we can't do testing, and is testing perpetuating an existing condition, an existing status quo? Yes, it is, in every respect, in terms of pronunciation, in terms of how you write essays. And why should you have to write an essay? Why can't you write a poem instead? If you write a poem for PTE, it's not going to get you very far. And maybe Duolingo accepts poems, I don't know. But other tests wouldn't, value that. But so yes, we are perpetuating that, but we need some kind of bar to measure against. There are a lot of questions in the chat. Should I look at the chat too, Sophie?
You can take a little. There's sort of some alongside discussion.
Yeah. Let me see if there's anything. Otherwise, you're talking. It's not just performance itself, but also the expectations of the listener. Yes, so a conversation is a two-way street, and this is something that I see people criticized about traditional pragmatics work, that the hearer, and pragmatics is called the hearer, was really just a prop. That was really just like a paper cutout that you were talking to, whereas in reality, it's a back and forth. And what the other person says shapes, context renewing, heritage 84. What the other person says shapes what you say next, and what you say next shapes how they respond, and so on. So it's not just the performance, it's also how the performance is shaped by the listener. And we have a practical issue there. How do we, how do we train the listener? How do we get listeners to do this in a way that is representative, authentic, and still comparable and standardized? Or do we pair learners with each other? Very common in the Cambridge world to pair learners together. I have my issues with that. Is ChatGPT the answer? Well, not necessarily ChatGPT, but some kind of chat AI. Is that going to be the answer to our problems? Maybe if we can actually pretend that it's a person. Is that ethical to pretend that it's a person and tell the learner, so you're talking to another learner when in fact it's a machine? I don't know. I think we're coming into a completely different new set of problems here that we've never talked about. Yes. There's more Q&A. Anthony, did you want to ask something?
Sorry, I wanted to ask you a question. Thanks for the very motivating and insightful talk. I want to know if you want to use CA principles in assessing IC, particularly say turn-taking and preferred or dispreferred responses. How would you do this?
With turn-taking, they tend to look primarily at the naturalness of gaps between turns. So are they very long? Are they very short? Sometimes you have overlaps that make perfect sense. You have collaborative completions that make perfect sense. How are turns how are TCUs? Do they recognize where the TCU ends? Those kinds of things can be looked at with preference organization. You can look at, do they provide background knowledge? And we have found that low-level learners in particular tend to foreground the message. They tend to not provide background knowledge, which people generally do. But we're already running into the emic-etic thing. CA people would say to you, but you don't have to. I mean, you can do it a different way. It can still be fine. And if it's fine for your interlocutor, who are you to say that it's not fine? Well, yes, but it's also done by raters. So raters will also have a sense of, is this fine or is this not fine? But I think where the problem was really, it was quite an advance to try to use CA principles by Yoon and Ikeda and so on. But I think the problem was there with that it's very mechanical, and something like turn-taking, you don't need to be very advanced to get that right. So I still remember I had a conversation with David years ago where I said, I don't think turn-taking is something worth assessing for high-level learners, because it's something that even low-level learners can do. It's probably almost like a human ability to sort of understand where the TCUs are and how to take a turn. I think David's big contribution was membership categorization analysis, the ugly stepchild of CA, bringing that in and bringing in the whole thing about social roles and bringing in the whole thing. And I skipped over the rating criteria for the role enactment slide, but there was all about predicates, what predicate is associated with fulfilling a social role. So it's a community member perspective that I think it is still CA adjacent, but it is less mechanical than the traditional CA thing. And I think it really does add something new. And I mean, John Pill and colleagues' work essentially went in a similar direction, not necessarily explicitly saying that, and David explicitly says it, but went in a similar direction of what are the expected, but we're getting into this problem of perpetuating stereotypes here. What are the expected behaviors and ways of talking and ways of displaying yourself for a particular social role? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Well, we're almost at time. I have one more question for you, which is somebody wants to know if you'll be presenting at AAAL next year.
Probably not. Where is AAAL next year? That's a very important.
I think it's in Florida? Houston,
Houston.
that's right.
Okay. Chances are no.
TBD on that. Stay tuned. But I will say thank you so much, Carsten, for this. And I just want to plug once more that if you didn't catch all of this, or if you'd like to revisit it or share with any of your friends or colleagues, we will be uploading this recording to the link that I just shared in the chat. That's our YouTube channel where we keep all of the recordings of our webinars in this series. So that's a great place to check this talk out and more. Anthony, I don't know if you have any few words of closing to say.
I just want to say that was a really motivating and insightful inside the applied linguistics kind of talk. I enjoyed it very much because you went into details which most speakers do not get into. So that was really important.
Thank you.
For our audience and for the wider membership.
Thank you so much. And we've got some thanks happening in the chat as well. Thank you all for tuning in. We really appreciate it. And stay tuned in your email for the invite to the next installment in this series. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.